Hi, K2 teachers, this is Sarah. Welcome to this professional learning module on word study. This professional learning was put together with the intent of K2 teachers being able to review it as a grade level team as your time allows this year, or watch it independently at your own time and pace. It's meant to be a flexible and optional resource for K2 teachers. As a district, we had started doing some planning last winter around doing some more formal professional development on word study and the foundational skills for the 2021 school year. And as with everything else, our plans changed. So instead, we're doing something that offers more flexibility, but yet addresses an important topic. I put this together after having done some extensive research and review, reading, consultation, and some professional development of my own. And I've relied on the expertise from a variety of sources to inform this work. So my hope is that this will help build our collective expertise and continue to refine our practice in the area of word study. So let's get going. So robust word study, and robust word study is always important and especially important this year with the instructional gap that we're seeing from students because of the remote learning. So the focus of this module is on universal instruction for all. We'll touch briefly on intervention and support services, but the focus is on the universal. Table of contents, links here to the slides if that's helpful. We're going to start big and broad with some reference and review, and then work our way down to specifically what does a lesson look like in the classroom, and then get into resources. So why are we focusing on word study, and why was it a topic that we've taken up in the district? I've had some feedback from teachers over the last year or two that they'd like some more support in how to teach word study and how phonics fits in there. I think we're always continuing to look at our systems and our instructional practices and make sure they're aligned with best practices, and make sure that they're as clear as we'd like them to be. Build our collective professional expertise, clarity around, I think I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about systematic and explicit instruction and what that entails, and the guided practice part of a lesson. So those two components. So have some clarity around that. I want to address the national debate that's been happening around sort of the reading wars and balanced literacy, and where we stand within that debate. And then also because this year we do have, our data indicates that we have an instructional gap in some places from the remote learning. So it's an especially good time to make sure that that our instruction is as clear and explicit as possible. Goals for the PD is that we have, that you walk away with a definition of explicit and systematic instruction in phonics and word study. You could explain it to someone, that we have a common understanding of a word study lesson framework, that we're starting to increase our alignment across a grade level and across the buildings, and we understand how word study fits within the larger balanced literacy system. So we have a lot of things in place already here in the district that I wanted to lift up. We have, most importantly, we have scope and sequences in K2. And as I've done my research review, scope and sequences are mentioned as, or are considered a best practice of explicit and systematic instruction according to all the resources. So we're in a good place we have that articulated sequence that builds in complexity, and the sequence is based on the Common Core State Standards. We also have common anchor resources and language. We have the universal alphabet with with the visual cues. We have foundations materials, and we use Words Their Way as a support resource. And when we talk about strategy instruction, we have common resource from the interactive strategies approach, and some common language when we talk about reading strategies. So I think there's some good things in place. We also have common CSD standards of practice, and within that standards of practice is a section on word study, and I'll get to that in a few slides. I always think it's good to refer back to the standards or to take a look back into the standards. I have a link here to the standards. I always learn something when I go back in the standards or see something that I didn't see before. I think what's important to remember is that we have a lot of standards in a lot of different areas in literacy, and the foundational skills are one section of a broad set of standards. So within the foundational skills, there's print concepts, phonological awareness, and phonics and word recognition. So we're going to probably live in this 2 and 3 for purposes of this module. So the one thing I did notice when I went back in and I was putting it together for this was this quote about the foundational skills that was in the introduction, and I hadn't seen it before, but I won't read it, but it gets at that instruction needs to be differentiated in the foundational skills, and that there's going to be students that need less than other students, and we know that. I think it's especially important in grade 1 as the year moves on, and in grade 2. In kindergarten and first grade, we might there might be less differentiation, but as we move into January of first grade and into second grade, it's an important consideration for the foundational skills. We also have an articulated balanced literacy model in CSD. We have the reading workshop with the various components: read aloud, direct instruction through mini lessons, teacher managed small groups, which is your guided reading, and independent reading. And writing workshop, we've articulated the direct instruction mini lessons and guided it independent practice. And then we have word study. And word study can live in either reading workshop or writing workshop, or it can be, a separate spot on your schedule. There's a lot of other work that we've done that connects to this work that I also think is important to highlight, because we're working on lifting our whole system. And I want to make sure we connect those dots. So we've done a lot of work on making sure our book rooms and our classroom libraries have high quality and accessible books for kids, engaging texts and texts that have more diversity and are from new publishers. And I think that's exciting work. We still have work to go, but I think we have a good start. We've done some work in each of the buildings on guided reading. And what does that look like? We have an articulated, consistent lesson structure that's linked here. And our resources for this section of the literacy block are from Fountas and Pinnell. And we have the Fountas and Pinnell Continuum book that is a useful resource for this area. We've done some work, especially at UMS and a little at Porter's, on the interactive strategies approach as a classroom-based intervention, and also to support universal instruction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. along with that, we have the common resource, this bookmark here, for strategy instruction and cueing systems. At Porter's Point, they've done what they finally called the ICBIG, which is their, I think that should be a C and not a G. It's their classroom-based intervention menu that a team developed at Porter's, and there's a link here. And then we have our genre-based mini lessons that are articulated on our curriculum maps, and we have some common resources that support that work. The Serravalle books, which we have in reading and writing, the Milwaukee books, and we actually are starting to add the Fountas and Pinnell mini lesson books slowly. What about intervention? I just want to quickly mention intervention. As I said, in Union, the focus for classroom-based intervention has really been based on the interactive strategies approach they've done. We've done lots of wonderful work with Marge and have used the text to support that work. And then at Porter's, this is the intervention, classroom-based intervention menu that has instructional practices connected to areas of need. And there's such strong alignment and collaboration with special services, title, and special ed. And that's certainly such an important part of supporting students through intervention. So I wanted to make sure we spend some time on the standards of practice for word study in universal instruction. We have some recommendations for time and frequency, and there's a little bit of flexibility there. So in a year like this year, you might want to beef up in terms of length and frequency. If you're finding, some of our data indicates from the phonics assessment that this is an area of need. So, go to the more towards the 30 minutes, 4 days a week. And maybe go lighter on the genre-based mini lessons. We have articulated in our standards of practice that instruction should be robust and explicit through mini lesson and demonstration. And that for each of the days of word study, there is some brief, explicit, direct instruction through mini lesson. It could be 5 or 10 minutes. We use the Foundation's materials with kids as a standards of practice. The cards, the posters are visible and used for direct instruction and to build a common language. So students can go from one setting to the next and recognize the resource that supports our work in the foundational skills. There's opportunities for guided practice with feedback and independent practice that's based on building automaticity. So we have a workshop model for word study as well as for reading and writing. So you start with the very explicit, clear, direct instruction, do a bit of guided practice, and there's some opportunities for application through independent practice. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that that independent practice is the goal of which is to build automaticity. Morning message may, and it's a great opportunity to reinforce the skills that you're teaching in word study instruction. Additional word study practice can be added and probably should be for especially the students who need more to the guided reading small group lesson, 10 minutes at the end, 10 minutes at the beginning. Word walls may also be used to reinforce word study skills. I've actually added a section to our balanced literacy framework with the standards of practice on word walls. And at some point, hopefully we'll get a chance to review that we monitor progress through formative assessments. I think we have a pretty good body of evidence in word study. We have the phonics assessment. I think most all of you use the developmental spelling inventory. This is
just a reminder that medical insurance buyout paperwork is due today. Insurance buyout paperwork is due today. Also, health screeners, please report to your designated location. Health screeners, please report to your designated location. Thank you.
Sorry about those announcements. So I think we have a really good body of evidence in word study. So what did I say? Phonics, spelling inventory, writing samples, our writing, our on-demand assessment. So I think we have data points that help monitor progress. That it's an active and engaging instructional approach, and word study skills are supported in reading and writing. That there's a focus on the application, and it's not too isolated. And I think I mentioned use of universal materials and language from foundations. So I have built into this module just some reflection points, and this is one of those reflection points. So, you can stop the video or not, and just go back to that standards of practice page and make sure that, or just think about what was surprising, important, confusing. What do you still wonder about as connected to that standards of practice? Okay, so I wanted to address the national debate that's happened around the reading wars are sort of back. They're it's kind of the same debate that's happened in years past, but the science of reading versus a balanced reading model or balanced literacy model. I have highlighted here some, or I've cited.
Hey everybody, I'm Malice Bay.
Sorry.
This is only for the adults, so if you're a kid, don't listen. And if you're a kid, you shouldn't be inside anyways, except for if you're an ace. In the cafeteria, we have some treats donated graciously by the Cheer Fund. This is your president, Mr. K. I hope you have a great day. Make it a good one or not. The choice is yours.
Sorry, I hope you guys have a good day too. Okay, so I have cited here, that phonics, this is in reference to phonics instruction, and I think you're probably well aware that there's evidence that, explicit and systematic phonics instruction makes a difference for kids. And the International Reading, what used to be called the International Reading Association, now called the International Literacy Association, came out in 2019 and endorsed systematic and explicit phonics in early reading. I don't think that was necessarily new for them, but they made that statement, so it got some attention. Hattie, if you're familiar with the visible learning resources, indicates that phonics and direct instruction have what he calls a positive effect size on student achievement.
Health screeners to your designated location right now. Thank you.
So sorry, but I don't want to stop the video and start again. And then the National Reading Manual from 2000 identified phonics and systematic phonics, phonemic awareness as improving reading achievement. So, I think where we land as a district is that our literacy model reflects our belief that the balanced literacy model that we have includes explicit and systematic instruction in phonics and word study. And we reflect that through our scope and sequence and through our anchor resources. I think what we want to work on moving forward is making sure that our instruction is explicit and systematic as possible. And we're going to be talking about that more as I move on here. And then, the question has come up several times about isn't just following, can we adopt a phonics program? I think for now, we're relying on for this year, we're relying on our scope and sequence and our anchor resources in developing our professional expertise. I have a link here to a page from a book that I very much love. It talks about, isn't just a phonics program enough. And what she says in this text is that the key to the effectiveness is not the program, but a systematic and explicit approach. So at this point, we haven't adopted a program. I have ordered some Foundations manuals in K and 1 for us to review and to see if they, would be a helpful support and resource for us in teaching the scope and sequence. So when those come in, I'd like to take some time as grade level teams to take a look at them and review them. So yeah, so take a moment to read this. It's very quick about, a phonics program. All right, so this is kind of the meat here is what does systematic and explicit approach mean? So explicit, when we talk about explicit, it means that instruction is direct, precise, and unambiguous. And I really like that language. That it's directly taught and it's stated and it's not discovered through like an inquiry approach or a direct approach or a discovery approach. So you tell them what the students what the skill is that you're going to be teaching through a learning target, and you use language that's as clear and precise as possible. So that's explicit. So I think what would not be explicit would be to say do a word study, sort, and have the students discover at the end what the skill was, as opposed to leading with this skill. Systematic is a curriculum that's articulated or specified sequential set of phonics elements, and that's our scope and sequence. It goes from, it makes sense. It goes from easy to more complex. I think it also includes some repetition cycle, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I think that's an important part. And it takes instruction from the known to the new in a way that makes new learning easier to grasp. So it's not all over the place, that you're sort of building on what they know to the more complex concept, and that helps them grab onto that new learning. So most sequences work in the ways that ours do. They start with phonemic awareness and the sounds of language, and they go to alphabetics, the symbols, and they move into phonics, sound symbol, and then they start with consonant, short vowels, digraph blends, closed syllables, and move to the next layer of long vowels and more complex vowel patterns, and then finally move to the morphology of language with word parts, meanings, homophones. So that's the general sequence, and I think ours is pretty well aligned with that. So this is another reflection point. Thinking about, could you explain systematic and explicit instruction to someone else? What was surprising, important, confusing, or what do you still wonder about? So sort of, you could do a stop and jot here. Now we're going to move to background on phonics and some of the issues that come up connected with phonics that I just want to make everyone aware of. This is a visual that's been around for a while. It's very often used in, workshops that you go to on the structure of language or phonics. And it just represents how the complexity of getting to skilled reading and what's involved. And there's a lot at play, and we're working on a lot at the same time. What we're working on for purposes of this module is the word recognition. But we're always working on all of this through our reading and writing workshop and throughout the day. Something that might come up or you might hear about or read about is analytic versus synthetic approaches to phonics. Analytic is when you sort of compare patterns or larger chunks like word families. And synthetic is when you blend individual sounds. And some programs are only focused on synthetic. We, in our scope and sequence, combine both. And, you know, I think very often you start with the analytic. It's kind of easier for students to grab onto. Students need to move to the synthetic. And then I think for efficiency's sake, for students, you tend to move back to the analytic because you need them to look at syllables and larger chunks. Queuing systems, I think I didn't want to lose sight that this is so interconnected to this work. So the queuing systems that we rely on from Scanlon, she talks about the strategies as both code-based strategies and meaning-based strategies. So I really like that. You know, we've in the past talked about MSV or meaning, structure, and visual, and I really like thinking of them as either code-based strategies or meaning-based strategies. And what we're focusing on for this work are the code-based strategies, so the phonics and the alphabetics. And what Scanlon says is that you know, developing readers and readers experiencing difficulties both benefit from instruction in both the code-based strategies and the meaning-based strategies to identify unknown words. And this strategy instruction is what you're focusing on in your small group and to some extent maybe in your mini lessons as well. But the word study that we're talking about here feeds directly into this code-based strategies. And then the other topic that might come up or you might read about is having a multi-sensory approach to phonics instruction. Because we don't rely on a program, we don't have a multi-sensory approach to our word study. Teachers may incorporate some multi-sensory strategies that they find effective, like tapping is one that is very often used. And some of what I read indicates that what multisensory or doing things in multiple modalities is most important to help with memory for students that have more significant learning challenges, and that it doesn't necessarily need to be a multisensory program for at the universal level. And then something else that I think is important for us to kind of have a common understanding about is decodable text. I think decodable text is a small amount of decodable text is really helpful, especially at the beginning levels for students to practice the skill that you're working on. And during, you know, it's a little bit during that shared reading part of the word study workshop. The Words Their Way poems are a great source for that, I think. I know there's lots of other things online too. And the Google folders that I think grade 1 has set up has one for each week. But the Words Their Way poems are a little bit more engaging. And it's really important for not to lose sight of balancing that with that it's a small amount and that it's balanced with more complex grade level text that you do in read alouds and level text in small group and independent reading that are engaging and more meaning based. What about Words Their Way? We have Words Their Way as a resource, I think, especially for it works especially well for the independent practice. I would say your foundations resources work are more conducive to the direct instruction part of your lesson, and the words their way are more conducive to your independent practice. And they could also be for your guided practice too, doing a sort together. I think what's important about the words their way resources is to make them as to make students do it as or to support students in doing it as actively as possible. And because I think a challenge with the resources can be that they can be very passive, and students aren't necessarily, they're only relying on the visual and not doing the analysis or the active work associated with it. So I think that's the challenge, and that should be the focus when we use the resources. I've put a few best practices down here as connected with words their way, making sure that it's not only the site, that they're sorting by site and by sound, and reading, as much reading and writing connected with the words their way. One of the things that Words Their Way talks about is look for what students use but confuse. And I think that's helpful when you're thinking about where students land on that sort of stage or instructional level for Words Their Way. So I think the zone for students is where they land. They have some confusions, but they're using some of it, but they still have some confusions. And another helpful reminder is that when they're doing the Words Their Way work, that they're really working on automaticity. So it's not only just accuracy, but really getting them to be automatic and be able to do it with speed. I thought that was a helpful reminder. I've put some resources here that may be helpful with the Words Their Way resources. When I first was trained with it, I was taught this to teach kids this protocol, and that's always a read. It's not just a go right to the visual sort, but you always do the reading, sort, check, and then reflect. And here are some other resources that may be useful in using those resources. There's an article that I've linked here that would be a good read. It's called Phonics Faux Pas, so what to avoid in phonics instruction or some missteps. And I've lifted what I thought was most important. The first one being using your direct instruction part during your phonics lesson for explanation of an activity or giving directions. We're reviewing what they're going to be doing for independent practice. So making sure that that direct instruction part, that short 5-10 minutes, is really preserved for that explicit instruction. The other thing that she talks about in this article is either overemphasizing instruction versus application, or vice versa, which I obviously have spelled wrong. And so making sure that there's a balance of that instruction for word study to the application. So making sure that you balance the word study instruction in your small groups and in the rest of your workshop, and there's not an imbalance between the two. Words Their Way, we talked about that a little bit. And then she talks about, I like this sort of verbal clutter, making sure, I think, getting at that explicit and systematic, that your language is as precise and clear as possible, and, limiting the language that you use. And that what might be helpful is, doing, your learning targets might be helpful for that. because it would help you be very clear about what the skill is you're teaching into. So this is another stopping point where you can stop and reflect on those issues that the phonics background and the issues that I brought up related to phonics. Was there anything that was surprising or important or confusing or questions that you have, so you don't lose track of those questions? Now we're going to get into what does the explicit word study lesson look like. I've made this resource here, and this is new, and I tried to get more precise about what a word study lesson looks like, or more prescriptive. And starting with what the goals of the lesson are, and then moving to what are the components. And I have 5 components here. So you wouldn't necessarily do all 5 components for each lesson, but your lesson would always contain some of these components. So, and I think review it is one that your lesson probably would always have a very short bit of. So you would always start with a little bit of reviewing and practicing for automaticity skills that you've already taught. So number 1, review it. Number 2, hear it. And that's work around phonemic awareness. And that would be oral and working with sound, segmenting, blending, manipulating sounds. And this is K, I would say, and, beginning of 1 and as needed, and as our scope and sequence articulates. So review it, hear it, decode it. So decode it is obvious, read words. This is, what our scope and sequence is focused on. Number 4, spell it. So you have the decode it and then the spell it. It's also called, it could be called encode it. So that would be writing words. And then read it. So it's reading, actual application of reading connected text. So for each of your lessons, you're going to have a very quick bit of review it, and then you would either have hear it, decode it, spell it, and then, probably if you're doing decode it, you're going to do read it. Whereas if you do spell it, you may not. And one idea that I'll show you on a possible lesson framework for the week is that you could have a focus on reading one day and then a focus on writing the next. So you could alternate 2 days, 3 on reading a week, 2 on writing, or 2 and 2. And then so here are your components, and this is your framework or your workshop model. So you have the direct instruction part. So this is 5-10 minutes. And within that direct instruction part, you have a review it, introduce it, what is the skill, and then you do a model it. And, this can be kind of the framework for each of your word study lessons. It's 5-10 minutes. You do a quick review, you introduce what the targeted skill is, and then you do some quick modeling of it through word building or blending or sound boxes. And it could be digitally on the whiteboard. It could be chart paper. And then you do a quick 10 to 15 guided practice. And I think the key for the guided practice is thinking about how you can get all students engaged. And whether that's, having each of the kids have word cards that they have to read that contains the introduced skill or sound, or they have whiteboards and they have to write it. It could be shared reading. of poetry, morning message, decodable text, could be a quick game. And then there's the independent practice part. So we're going to spend less time on the independent practice because I think that's a more developed area. So lesson framework, that was very quick, but so we had the lesson components, the lesson framework, and then this is just a very drafty outline of what your week could look like. And with your learning target articulated, what your review would be. Like what would be your quick review building automaticity? Could be drilling the sounds from foundations. That's probably very often what that's going to be. And then what's your direct whole group instruction? So you're going to introduce a sound, you're going to use cards or digital tiles, and you're going to do some blending, sound blending for 3 different words. And then what's your guided whole group? You're going to have, you can see here, I did read it on Monday, I did write it on Tuesday, read it, write it. So you're going to have on Monday, you're going to have some word cards that each student have facing down in a circle, and they flip them over, and you have as many students as you can read them as time allows. And then you have a sort for independent practice that's connected with the skill that you introduced. You have some reinforcement of what you taught in your morning message. You include some sight words. You leave some short vowels out for students to fill in. And then here's your connection to guided reading. So you're going to have them do a word hunt, maybe of the text that's not what I wrote there, but, and maybe, you're going to do a quick word hunt for words that have the skill that you taught into, and maybe, your lowest 2 groups, you're going to do a quick making words activity that connects with the skill that you taught. And then you're going to do some of that hear it in your transitions throughout the day. You're going to be guess my secret word, lots of fun games that you can do in transition time. So that's a model of what it could look like using this, this kind of outline. Blending is, I just put this in because I think it's a pretty important part of the direct instruction part of your lesson, that you're going to do a lot of blending work, especially in towards the end of kindergarten and for all of 1st grade. And it's really the primary strategy to teach kids to decode words. And then you might hear, when referring to blending, that you might hear about continuous sounds, or you might be familiar with that. They tend to be the easier sounds to learn because you don't add that sound at the end. They're continuous. I have a video here if you want more information about continuous sounds. And then when you're talking about blending, there's what they call final blending. And that's 1 sound at a time. And I think this tends to be for very early and for struggling readers. And then there's what's called successive blending, where you string your sounds together and you don't pause between your sounds. There's also a strategy that I think in the Sarah Vowell book, I don't know if she calls it the crash strategy or run into it, that would fall under that successive blending category. I just wanted to make you aware of that. Not sure. So this is just another stopping point for you to reflect on that lesson framework. What do you think? What was surprising or important or not, or confusing? And what do you still have questions about? Anchor resources. I just want to make sure that we have a common understanding of what our anchor resources are in this area. So obviously Foundations and Words Their Way, we've had for a while. I've tried to add a few resources that's connected. This is a PowerPoint slide that I can send to you where you have the letter tiles from Foundations that you could use for direct instruction. And this is another site, it's free. I think it's really great reading that you could project and use for direct instruction. I know there's a lot of resources related to Foundations in Seesaw that you could access. And this is a free fund on the Wilson site. It's a free page that has resources. I think the intent is that these packets are meant for parents. I would think they could be useful for us to build our own common language. They outline each of the grades and some of the language. I wouldn't use them with parents because we don't use the program in its entirety. And then, as I said, I've ordered a few manuals from Foundations for us to review and look at. And then last week, I sent an email or it came from Wilson or Foundations, or you should have gotten an email that allows you to set up on this, what's called the Fun Hub. It's a digital resource site for Foundations. I think there's some things on this site that could be useful for you. There's a tile board that you could use during direct instruction. There's the sound cards, there's the posters. So for the direct instruction part, you could project these Foundation resources more easily. You may not need to be as reliant on the posters. And you could dump them into your slideshows. So make sure you set up an account for that. If you have any questions, let me know. In grade 1, and I think in grade 2 and K2, that you have resources by the week in Google Drive. And these for first grade are great. They have some words that you could use in your direct instruction for blending. They have a poem from Word Study. This could be something that I work on for you more, or you could work on as a team once we have some time. And we could make them more like a lesson template. It's something to consider as we move forward. Word Matters is, I know I haven't purchased that, but I think there's some of these around. It's a good book to use for word lists if you're looking for word lists for blending. This is a free site, at least for this year. It's called Flyleaf Publishing. They have some books that might have some of the patterns or skills that you're teaching into that you could project during direct instruction. I'm working on putting together this PD video board, and it looks like this. And putting together resources for some of the instructional strategies and areas connected to word study and the foundational skills. So you see a whole bunch of videos here on Elkonin and sound boxes, making words, Foundations drill, guided reading, strategy, instruction. It's just a place to put together a bunch of resources. If you want more information about a particular strategy or want to see it in action, there are videos here. These are the resources that I use to inform a lot of this work. I very much like this book, Letters, Lessons, and First Words. It could be something that, that we do a book study on in the future. This Wiley Blevins has done a lot of books and resources, but I think they're all through Scholastic, and he's he was recommended to me by Marge, and it's a very no-nonsense resources on phonics. And then International Literacy Association has some brief papers on some of the issues that the debate that's been going on around phonics instruction. Phonological awareness resources. These are a couple old ones that are still, I think, really good. And then this is one that someone shared with me recently that is part of an OG training, I think, that special educators are doing, but it looked like a good classroom resource because it has it broken down into universal instruction. So I'll look into getting some of those for our teams. Here are the references that I use for this work. And then just to remember to have fun with this. It can be a really fun part of your literacy block. And lastly, I'd really appreciate if you fill out this survey. It'll give me good information about what would be useful for you moving forward in terms of more information in this area, and what was helpful from this presentation. Here's an appendix. This has just additional background information about phonics and phonological awareness, some good explanations if you feel like you need more information. And lastly, here's a glossary with all the terms and some definitions, if that's useful. So I'm hoping this slide deck can kind of serve as a reference for us, and as we find other good resources, I'll dump it in. So thanks for listening.